So I don't think this will really come as a shock to anyone. If anything, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that this decision has come over a decade too late. So before I kind of go into the details of what's just happened, I need to obviously go back a little bit between 2011 and 2014. Now, because it's going to be a little bit serious at the beginning, because it just covers some heavy topics, I'm going to do trigger warnings of like eating disorders and attempts at, extreme depression, okay? Attempts at one's life and things like that. That's kind of the theme, heavy at the beginning. You can skip if you're not into that. So between 2011 and 2014, my undergraduate, I was completely anorexic. If you're watching, you'll remember this illness was a compound of decades of trauma and bullying and abuse, and I found a lot of solace and safety in the comforts of my university. I basically spent every day that I wasn't at one of my jobs in the university library, and I just devoured books, one after the other. And after my fifth and attempt at removing myself from this planet, which was in 2015, so it's going up to a decade now, I constructed a mantra for myself that I say at the end of every video, which is, books save lives, so keep reading. And it's a mantra I wrote to myself after that very scary time, because I went through it all very much alone. I didn't have a network other than people on YouTube and some booksellers that I worked alongside. And a couple of kind university lecturers who sometimes took time to talk to me, sometimes over coffee, and just chat to me like I was a normal human being, which was kind of rare. I was on the waiting list for many years for my eating disorder, and as much as I love the NHS, they really unfortunately let me down during that period of my life, and I wouldn't be alive today if I hadn't found my love of books, because sadly medical intervention did not get in there in time. Despite being severely ill, I never asked for help or support from the university. I never asked for any extensions or considerations to be given when marking my examinations or essays, which they accommodate. So if you have a flu, you can actually ask for kind of extra credit, effectively. But despite me being deserving of them, I never asked for any of that. I also was a bit of a swot. I never missed a single lecture or a seminar. My entire university life, I read absolutely everything that was ever listed on every weekly reading list. Now, the reason I never asked for help or any extensions during that time was because I told myself that although I was dying and my health was dire, it was entirely self-inflicted, and as such, I didn't deserve help. Unlike people who are ill with illnesses such as cancer and flus and huge emotional experiences such as grief, I told myself that I had to work hard to make up for my failings as a human, and because it was all self-inflicted, I didn't deserve any extra time or consideration or extra credit or extensions, because though my BMI at its lowest was 11 for several years, that was entirely my fault. Now, that's obviously over a decade ago. And it's taken me a decade later to realise that, no, it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't self-inflicted. And it was the result of abuse, primarily, and a lot of trauma, and I had denied myself so much aid during those years out of shame and embarrassment, because I never even spoke about what I had gone through that got me to that point. And if you're ever in that position, or are currently in the position, please don't make the mistakes I did. It's not your fault. You are capable of recovery, but you are allowed to ask for help. Not only did I suffer, but my research suffered as well. And in a twisted way, which requires far more therapy, I'm actually more upset about the latter. I'm really upset that my research wasn't as good as it could have been all those years ago, because I didn't ask for help that I deserved. But this time, I've learned from my mistakes, and I won't allow it to happen in the latter half of my PhD. So this time I acted quicker, not immediately. I kind of went on for a couple of years hoping I could push through it. But when I hit a massive horrific thing last year, I decided to go, no, I'll go to a doctor. And I went to them very quickly, and I went frequently, and I applied for support from professionals both inside and outside the institution, and I was very open and honest about my circumstances with my supervisors. And as of the beginning of February, I was granted a leave of absence. Now, I was actually quite surprised at how quickly I was given a leave of absence, and I'm incredibly grateful for my institution for responding appropriately to the severity of the situation, which makes me more sad that I never asked them for help over a decade ago, as they evidently would have given it me quite easily. And they would have responded accordingly to ensure that the students' health and well-being was not suffering even further. Is it bad that I have done this more for my research than for myself? Perhaps. But we all have different motives in everything in life, and I was mainly unhappy with how little of myself I could give to the quality of what I was doing, both primarily academically but also professionally. I've always valued my ability to read analytically and write with some, intrigue and curiosity and a willingness to confront my ignorances and find out the answers, because I find that process incredibly entertaining. The idea of not knowing something and figuring it out and then seeing the network that evolves from that. I love the exploratory process of unfolding research questions and going down rabbit holes that I discover along the way. But I became unwell, and my ability to do that, not only to my standards, but with the passion and my health intact, without deteriorating any further, became severely compromised. Now, whilst I should feel incredibly relieved and grateful that I've been given a leave of absence, which I am, I can't help but feel incredibly sad and primarily ashamed. You see, I'm so used to being able to push through and get on with it all by myself. And for the past 3 years, I've been struggling so badly, and I've made myself incredibly ill and in a lot of pain. And unfortunately, I've always had this kind of twisted sense of pride in my past self for doing all of that whilst being incredibly unwell and, dying and not having any support and not having help. That's sick. I can admit that. That's sick, that I have pride in that. And I should have pride in it, but also primarily for myself. It leaves me now feeling a lot of shame, because whilst you should be proud for getting through it, it shouldn't be a goalpost to strive for. So now I've asked for a leave of absence. A decade later, I feel like I failed in working hard enough. I failed in putting on a brave face and just sucking it up and getting on with it, even though I physically couldn't. It got to the point where it got really dangerous last year. Yet I still feel incredibly disappointed in myself for messing it up so badly, for not doing it right the first time, for not doing it so right that I didn't put myself in danger and get ill. Because if I were intelligent enough, if I were hardworking enough, if I were better, if I were more ambitious, if I were more focused, if I were more determined, I wouldn't have gotten ill in the first place, and thus I wouldn't have had to take a leave of absence. So thus, me asking for the grace that I needed later in life, in my early 30s, it feels like I've devolved and become a lesser human than I was a decade ago. But I suppose undoing that mindset, along with many other things, is part of the recovery process. So what does that really mean for this channel? Why am I telling you this? Little bits. Not really in terms of structural, because nothing really will change here. Because whilst I can take a break from academia, I'm self-employed. I don't get paid leave. That's not an option. So to prepare myself to be well enough to return to academia, it actually requires me to lean into my passions more, and whilst my research is on pause, sorting out who I am in the realms of beyond academia and within academia is a process that may unfold here. Primarily, it will confront me. I think I really messed up in terms of my identity purely as a student. I am primarily a literature student. I studied classics in my undergraduate degree, but I went into English literature. I specialised entirely in looking at the classical influence on postmodern and modernist texts, and also branches of philosophy. So my interest was the intersect between English literature and ancient classics and mythology. Because a video did very well on here a couple of years ago now, about me just debunking history and this insane take that ancient Rome did not exist, I wrongly interpreted that as, oh, I have to go into the history realm now. Sorry, my dog is barking, but she will always bark. So I wrongly interpreted that as me having to lean into history, and because I felt very out of place in my department as a primarily literature student, I tried to work really hard to make up for the things that I lacked in, which primarily classics and ancient history, as a more historical perspective. And that put on a lot of pressure on myself, because I'm trying to prove myself as this classicist. When I love classics, and that is my field of research, but I teeter between two realms of literature and classics, and my strength lies in literature. And actually my strength lies in dissecting things, and I kind of missed the point. You see, when that video did very well about me debunking these insane claims, my skill isn't in my ability to regurgitate historical facts off the top of my head. My ability in that video was actually my skill set, which was I'm actually really good at seeing flaws in argument and picking them apart and finding out resources to accommodate them. So that's the same with why I'm a researcher in the first place. What I love about academia in general is picking apart loose threads or finding threads and putting them together and talking about that. And I then wrongly teetered myself into a historical area, when really I lie in the realms of history in context with literature, and also looking at ancient texts. So I specialised entirely in ancient texts and ancient philosophy. And I looked at history in terms of the history of the books when they were written, what was happening in Rome at the time when Ovid was writing, what we know about the Bronze Age Greece and how that reflects in the Iliad and epics, etc. So I'm normally someone who specialises in looking at history around the literature, the texts themselves. And really I think I need to go back to my roots in terms of re-engaging with the ancient texts and leaning into my strengths. I am not someone who's clearly this casual historian. I'm rather someone who focuses entirely more on history and the realities surrounding literature. So the core is always usually the text, and I work my way outwards. So really that's what I'm planning on doing over the next year here. Over here I talk about obviously history, but I want to look at more ancient texts. So I want to be going back to dissecting the threads and the history around texts such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, looking at Sappho's poetry, but then also leading into my favourite areas, which is contemporary texts. I say contemporary quite loosely. I want to say modern, but when I'm talking about modern, I'm talking about anything from the Jacobean period to the 20th century. The ways I enjoy looking at how the classical world and classical texts influence more contemporary or modern literature, from Shakespeare plays to James Joyce's Ulysses to Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and postmodernists, modernists, and even, Victorian era, basically where the classical world punctuates more later literature. My fascination is usually how the classical texts and classical concepts punctuate contemporary areas. I must admit, I'm not too much of a fan of 21st century areas, but that's what my whole PhD research is. So the idea that I stay away from that topic for a while is more a benefit to me anyway. But when it comes to Shakespeare, mad about it. When it comes to James Joyce, we can go on about it. So I want to look at that area when I'm looking at future video content. So texts such as contemporary modernism, postmodernism, Shakespeare plays, anything in between, how myth punctuates the canon, the literary canon as we know it. Additionally, also looking at the ancient texts themselves in more detail and just discussing really interesting factoids that I will draw out to make engaging content, ideally, that people are interested in, how to read these texts. If you're interested in that, I hope you do stay around, because I want to tap into who I am, which is not clickbait worthy. It's not really something people are Googling in their spare time, but also I think I've been doing better the past few months leaning into my strengths, which is literature, and then punctuating that with historical context and understanding of things. Similarly, I have a second channel where I talk about more philosophy, nerdy philosophy kind of things, and how philosophy and even literature can influence our reality. I just did a video over there about overthinking and Hamlet. If you're interested in kind of nerdy discussions like that in the more selfie help realm, it will pop over there. Any updates around workloads and leaning into literature more will all be released on my newsletter, so the link to sign up for that is down below. And again, if you have any requests in a similar vein to this, or you'd like to see me cover, then I also have a Google Docs form down below. Thank you so much for listening to this very self-indulgent context. I knew I had to do a video about pausing the PhD because it would become evident eventually that I don't reference it or mention it. But also I hope that I can get better enough to return sooner rather than later. But we'll find out. But thank you so much, as always, for watching and supporting by sharing or commenting or liking. Thank you as always to my Patreon members for being my little rocks on the internet. I will see you soon for another video. So remember, books save lives. So keep reading.